Welcome back to the second session of the day. I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Richard Mcgregor, who will be talking to us about the evolution of tomb dressing as an Islamic ritual for the dead. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Mcgregor.
Great. Thank you, Yasmin, and thanks to RC and AUC and all of our colleague institutions for bringing us together. And clearly there's already a wonderfully wide, discursive, and historical range that we are here together to think about, each of us from our own particular positions of expertise. And it's wonderful to be having these kind of conversations, covering some of that ground that we certainly would not be covering in our discipline-specific conversations. So there's really is a value, I think, in the collective mind here, and these wide, big, sort of thematic challenges that our fields each contribute to in many ways. Good. Okay. Well, I have a short paper to read. The Evolution of Tomb Dressing as an Islamic Ritual for the Dead. Covering tombs is a widely practiced strategy for venerating the departed. Examples abound in Islamic history, and yet the ritual and visual practices associated with tomb coverings has received little attention from scholars. This is likely the case for two reasons. The first is the ephemeral nature of the objects themselves, by which I mean their short lifespans, typically exposed to the elements. In other words, it's hard to study objects that keep falling apart, and very few of which have been around for very long. The second reason is the dearth of attention these objects have received in formal Islamic discourse, more specifically the legal and ritual articulations with which scholarly attention might have engaged. In short, the fuqaha don't talk about tomb coverings, much less their inscriptions. And yet, upon reflection, these objects will reward the attention any careful researcher brings to bear. The purpose of my presentation here is to simply communicate some of the most obvious and interesting dynamics of tomb coverings as Islamic practice. It was back in the 1980s that Lisa Golombek brought our attention to the great terminological variety of Islamic textiles, a fact she argued is evidence of the central role textiles have played in Islamic culture. She also warned against the blind spots toward textiles that are easily reproduced in our considerations of architecture, when we do not recognize the important function of hangings and carpeting in just about all pre-modern buildings. She proposed the term textile mentality. While I think the term mentality in her neologism, textile mentality, might usefully be dropped, Golombek is still connecting some important dots for us. Connecting dots for us as we think about tomb coverings and veilings, specifically how the wider visual culture, heavily imbued by textiles, feeds into the expression of religious culture, the religious culture that is tomb coverings. In the following pages, I will present some examples of tomb covering with particular focus on the material and visual dynamics at play. But what, then, are we looking at? When thinking about the medieval Islamic practice of covering venerated tombs with inscribed textiles, we still need to work out the interrelatedness of the components. as well as the ritual and devotional models of practice that animated them. On the first point, it's important to note that we are dealing with more than a simple composition of fabric plus text plus stone. Here, I'm building on the insights of Lars Spierbrock, who writes eloquently of what he calls the quote-unquote sympathy of things. On draped walls in domestic contexts, for example, he writes, "The textile inhabits the stone, not as material, but as a technique and as a logic. The abstraction of materials work in both directions," he says. "Stone abstracts textile, and weaving abstracts carving," unquote. And elsewhere he adds, quote, "Things take on pattern and shape by conditioning each other. Things design one another through entanglement," unquote. They are each appearing with something of the other as part of them. And in several ways, the sense of entanglement and inhabiting is at work in these objects. Let us turn to Islamic practices of pilgrimage for some of this aesthetic and ritual context. The Hajj is a pilgrimage, but because it is a ziyarah to the house of God, it is apparently of a different order than pilgrimage to a saint shrine or to a prophet's tomb. Nevertheless, it stands within the category pilgrimage and shares much with other examples in that classification. The covering of tombs, along with the rituals generated around them, are thus from a religious culture shared with the Kaaba and Hajj practices. I'm arguing that while the vectors of influence and evolution don't always move in a straight line or in the same direction, we can usefully consider the Kaaba veiling and the related Hajj practices as significant sources for the wider rituals and materials of tomb dressing. Rather than saying that they are a model for imitation, let's instead say they offer possibilities for this inhabiting and this entangling. Objects with objects, and I would add objects with people. Let us note first that dressing religious objects other than the Kaaba with elaborate coverings was a rather common practice. Venerated stones, walls, and even pulpits were candidates for such honors. One revered stone, that of the Sakhra in Jerusalem, was for a time regularly dressed. Actually, for quite a long time, was regularly dressed. More than one source from the mid-15th century describes a rich brocade kiswa covering the rock. At one point, the prophet's minbar, preserved in the courtyard of his home in Medina, was covered with a veil of white Egyptian cotton. Though none of these dressing practices can be considered central to the pilgrimage, and some were rather short-lived, together they are clear evidence of an active and at times experimental religious culture of veiling. Perhaps it is not surprising to find that the station of Abraham, Maqam Ibrahim, the stone bearing his footprints as he put the final stones in place on the Kaaba, has also received such attention, and it has received plenty of attention. The stone's proximity to the Kaaba kept it a prominent feature in the Hajj landscape. Another object located near the Kaaba, the enclosure or hijr of Ismail, also received a covering. The Mamluks had sent it in 1448, but it was hung only 2 years later. The most elaborate site of tomb dressing beyond the Kaaba, however, was the Prophet's tomb in Medina. This practice can be dated back to the 1st century and a half after Muhammad's death. The status of Medina, the Prophet's home, including his grave and that of family members and immediate followers, along with many important sites in early Islamic history, was never a settled question among jurists. Generally, the Hanafi school denied the status of Medina, while other schools recognized it. So sort of contested sanctity for Medina and that site. The complex debates around the status of the Prophet's grave continued contributed to the conceptual matrix within which Kiswa practices evolved. According to one early historian of Medina, the first to hang a full kiswa over the tomb of the Prophet was the Hamdanid ruler Saif ad-Dawla, dies 967. The early Abbasid caliph Harun al-Rashid, dies 809, had perfumed the grave and covered it in silk, which in the opinion of the historian al-Samahudi didn't count as a kiswa. The Samahudi also describes a kiswa, that is dress, sent by the Fatimids in the late 12th century. This white covering, satara, displayed text and was adorned with white and striped medallions. Additionally, a red silk sash bearing the text of Surah Yusuf, Surah Yasin, the 36th chapter of the Quran, was run around the grave. The Shia identity of the Fatimids clearly came into play, not in the least because they were the great rivals of the Abbasids for leadership of the Muslim world and control of the central sites of Mecca and Medina. We are told that the governor of Medina blocked this Fatimid installation while he sought permission from the Abbasid caliph al-Mustadi bi Amr Allah in 1180. The covering was a violet silk with inscriptions and striped medallions. The earlier Fatimid covering was removed and sent to the Mashhad of Ali in Kufa, so connecting shrines through this material practice. Al-Samahudi continues the story, describing how the Abbasid caliph and Nasir al-Din Allah, 1225, commissioned a covering of black silk, which hung over that of his predecessor. Al-Nasir's mother had a third covering hung on the grave after her return from the Hajj. We have a wonderful, long tradition of elite women involved in this patronage around shrines and coverings. Over the course of the following century and a half, the kiswa of the Prophet's grave would make several appearances in the historic record. Coverings for the inside of the chamber typically consisted of a patterned fabric and a hizam, or belt. In 1256, a fire destroyed the roof of the Prophet's house and several valuable Qurans, including, in addition to the Prophet's minbar, or pulpit, and the tomb covering of the noble precinct. A few decades later, we hear of a Mahmal parade in Cairo, a Hajj parade in Cairo, which included a new covering for the Prophet's shrine. In 1353, Sultan Salah ad-Din Saleh established a permanent endowment, or waqf, the revenues of which would cover the cost of producing new kiswas for the Prophet's tomb and his pulpit every 5 years. So yes, these objects were expensive, and the elite patrons needed to worry at times about paying for the steady supply, right, of these objects. In the late 16th century, a covering for the Prophet's tomb was ritually bestowed upon the Amir al-Hajj, along with the kiswa for the Kaaba, of course, with both being processed within Cairo. A modern survey of kiswas dating from the 16th to the 20th century identifies the coverings of the Prophet's grave as a stylistically distinct group of hangings. Typically, a black background was used for Kaaba coverings, a red one was used for kiswas that hung inside the Kaaba, and green fabrics were used for the Prophet's tomb. This is a rather late sampling, but the typology, the color typology generally holds. The earlier you get, the more scattered are those choices, those color aesthetic choices. For the Kaaba, for the Kaaba, but also for the tomb of the Prophet. A 19th century covering for Fatima's tomb near Muhammad's close to her father's grave is also green, family of the same family. The inscriptions mention her by name, and we're going to run through some inscription contents here. You notice that you have to imagine this being designed to drape over, right? So the text looks upside down, but it won't be once it's installed. Perhaps the most prominent monument in Cairo to the family of the Prophet is the shrine of the martyred grandson Hussein. The intrepid 12th century traveler Ibn Jubayr left us with an account of some of the devotional activities at the shrine. He comments on devotees crowding to the grave, throwing themselves upon it, kissing it, and tenderly running their hands over its kiswa covering. However, it is not until the 19th century that we get any detailed descriptions of the tomb covering. In the 1890s, Stanley Lane Poole recalls a green silk covering with a white band bearing Quranic inscriptions. This grave covering is likely similar to the one donated 50 years earlier by Hussein Pasha al-Qutban, who made a pilgrimage to the shrine, distributing meat to its servants of the shrine and to the local poor, in addition to presenting a new kiswa to the shrine. So, sort of underlining this wide ritual culture that's behind these objects, the movement and the emplacement of these objects. Another intertwining, both spiritual and material, of Hajj practices and funerary dress is represented in the reuse of fragments of the previous year's Kaaba Kiswa, right? So as the Kiswas go to Mecca, right, they're replaced typically every year, but the one from the previous year goes back into circulation in a certain sense. Around Damascus, the shrines of the descendants of the Prophet, Zainab bint Ali, Ruqayya bint Hussein, and others likely, would receive remnants of the Kiswa that had been brought back on the Hajj. Likewise, the tomb of John the Baptist in the Umayyad Mosque and the shrine of Sheikh Arslan, the Sufi patron saint of Damascus, were bestowed Kiswa fragments. The Sa'diyya Sufi order had a long association with the Kiswa and regularly received remnants for their Cairo shrine. And I cannot find that shrine in the modern period, but many additional sites associated with the Prophet's family received tomb coverings. The Mamluk Sultan Baybars, so 13th century, seems to have embarked on a campaign to renovate the great shrines in his domain, including the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron. Also the grave of Joseph in Nablus, the tomb of Moses in Jericho, and that of the companion of the Prophet Abu Huraira located at Yanbeh. This revival included the regular supply of new tomb kiswas. Near the end of the 15th century, Sultan Qaitbay sent an elaborate covering with a floral motif to the tomb of Abraham. This covering includes brief texts running across two panels. This noble cavern, a reference to the shrine complex itself. The kiswa also bears the tughra of the Ottoman Sultan and stylized mosque lamps. Details have not come down to us, but Sultan al-Huri had several black curtains of silk made, each designed and decorated for a specific prophetic tomb. These small kiswas were paraded around Cairo, led by the custodian of the Shrine of Abraham, accompanied by musicians and troops of Sufis and others. Another example is the covering for the tomb of the prophet Moses. Here we see the Chronic Inscription chosen refers specifically to the tomb's inhabitant. The full verse reads, there are messengers whose stories we have told and others we have not, and God spoke directly to Moses. The zigzag pattern closely parallels examples from the Kaaba kiswas and those we just saw for the prophet's grave in Medina. An inscription band that very likely hung over the tomb of Jonah is preserved today in Istanbul. It's a very busy slide. I apologize. I kind of gave you a breather with the first. Here's the text. There's a lot there. While several locations claim the tomb of Jonah, the shrine mosque in Halhul, only 3 miles from Hebron, founded in 1226 by the Ayyubids and later restored by the Mamluks, is almost certainly where this belt hung. The inscription reproduces the Quranic account of the Jonah story, making clear the purpose-built nature of this covering. We noted earlier the association of tomb coverings with Kaaba veiling. The processing mahmals and kiswas of the Hajj also had their local counterparts. They had the counterparts in the parading and covering of tombs of great saints. The yearly festival, or Mulid, of Abu al-Haggag, who dies in the middle of the 13th century in Luxor, is the most prominent example. The festivities are highlighted by an elaborate parade which incorporates processing tomb coverings. A group of mahmals is circulated, consisting of the coverings of the graves of Abu al-Haggag and his 5 sons, each of whom have their location on the local sacred landscape. The mahmals are preceded by a group of 8 to 10 standard bearers. They display the names of the tomb's occupants, along with the names of God, invocations for the saintly departed, and Quranic passages such as that on Abu al-Haggag's covering, the 4th in this procession line, which runs, "We have granted to you a clear victory." By processing together, there is a clear intention to reinforce the connections between shrine sites. So these coverings have this whole parading life, brought out, mounted, circulated in the city according to well-established patterns, and linking them to other shrine sites in the topography. That is a very repeated model in Egypt. This tomb kiswa, right. So this kiswa also visits prominent religious sites around Luxor. Along its parade route, the colorful procession of the coffins stop at several local saint shrines where the Fatiha and other prayers are recited to mark their visit. Further examples of tomb coverings being processed can be found in Qina, Asfun, and other towns in Upper Egypt, and I'm sure other places that I have yet to uncover. I hope this quick overview of tomb dressing has not only made clear the entangling of textile, text, and stone, but also the mutual inhabiting of kiswas with human bodies, both living and dead. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGregor. This was fascinating. Do we have any questions?
Thank you for that presentation, Dr. McGregor. Can you hear me? Okay. I was wondering, with the start of your presentation, you were talking about how these objects also kind of disintegrate. They have a life cycle of their own. And I was wondering if in your research you found how these communities decide when to replace the objects, whether it's these mantles or bands or other objects. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, you're right. Yeah, I began by complaining how nature, the toll that the elements take on tomb coverings, and everyone, all curators everywhere, are stressed out by the disintegration of these wonderful objects. Yes, there's that. There's also the politics of it, and an important dimension not brought out here in my talk is this sense of patronage, this sense of custodianship. So who sent the Kiswa Kaaba? Who was allowed to cover the Kaaba? Well, that was going to be kind of bare knuckles fight for control, for patronage, to be recognized as the patron of the two holy places. The mahmal, the large colored palanquin, very inscribed, of the same family as tomb coverings that circulated as part of Hajj culture, would leave Egypt, but could also leave other centers and would go down and do the Hajj, and itself would get into conflict with other mahmals that could be sent. And we even have some wonderful pictures from around 1910 of mahmals, like battleships, meeting on the Hajj, and it's not gonna, it's gonna end in violence. So patronage, control, right? The whole act of covering, of controlling these sites, of being seen to control these sites through these objects, right? Is a deeply developed and has a long history. So what you could do is you could go down, and we have wonderful examples of the Kaaba Kiswa, but other sites where there's a change in regime, and the first thing to do is send down Kiswas, and they go over the existing ones in Mecca and Medina. So this is through the medieval period. They're woven up deeply with patronage and politics.
Hi, can I just a follow-up question on that, and that is, we saw the Kiswa for Moses from Ramallah, which seems to be in excellent shape and in good condition. So is that an example of one that would have been taken for as a result of a political change, or was it sort of seized as an objet that would be, something that the Topkapi Palace would want, or what have you? I understand your answer on how the new Kiswas come in, but how did that change? How did some of these beautiful pieces that you show that have not disintegrated come into the hands of those entities? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, and the handful that I found, I was very thankful to the universe for preserving those with the names of the prophets on them. Right, so we know. I mean, it's pretty clear, right, where they are, who they're for, and the Mamluk one is gorgeous. It is a priceless, beautiful object. It's the best, I think, of Mamluk. Almost all of these preserved, collected in the Ottoman period, taken to Istanbul. So most of these are Topkapi pieces. So the Topkapi, so the Ottoman Empire, right? Istanbul, the capital, the Topkapi Palace, right? The seat included a relics room and big khazanas for collecting sort of everything of value of the empire. Those of us who work in manuscripts, shed a tear. We're in Cairo. They hoarded thousands of valuable manuscripts. Relics, all kinds of relics, made their way from Egypt, but also from Arabia and other parts of the Levant in the Ottoman period up to Istanbul. So there is this, so post-Mamluk, there is this kind of migration of these objects up into the Ottoman, the port. I mean, up in that place, Topkapi. It's an incredible collection of material. It's a stunning collection of materials, and there's tons of work that needs to still be done. And I would encourage anyone younger than myself who has energy to dive into the Topkapi stuff. They're more and more open, and there's loads of this type of material. And I was saying also kind of relic and more devotional stuff collected over centuries that will pay out if with good, careful study. So, but yeah, we're lucky. We don't have a ton of documentation, and that migration of objects. People talk about the relics. Oh, Salim conquered Egypt. He overthrew, right, the Mamluks, and he took the relics. And that's sort of thrown around by historians. I have dug into that. There's we don't have anything in the Arabic sources about the movement of those materials and what he took. He went out to Qaid Bey. He did some rituals. He liked the mahmal, is what the Arab sources say, some Yehudi and others. And that's all we have. So we don't have a record of him or other sultans or other functionaries drawing these appropriating these materials for the Ottomans. But they did. But yeah, so the Turkish material is something that I am not at all strong in. So somebody needs to work on that question from the Turkish side.
Okay, one last question, because we're behind them.
I read as fast as I could. I knew it.
In the description and the language of the transport of the mahmals and the Kiswa, is there a resonance with bridal imagery, gendered imagery, images of veiling and the palanquins of brides?
Yes, and Doris Abu Saif has one article, I think it's sort of the go-to article on female patrons. I mentioned the mother of Harun al-Rashid, who's champion, but there are sort of a whole series of prominent women who have made a great impact as patrons on the sort of material culture of sites in Mecca and Medina, around relics, around tomb coverings, and around supporting mahmals. So there's something to be said about just the gender identity of that form of patronage, and it would reward more reflection. I think there's a lot more to tease out there. The materials themselves and the rituals, Kiswa, dress, right? I mean, it's a dress. These objects are wearing dresses, right? And they talk about the raising of her dress, right? Because pilgrims tear at the bottom of the Kiswa, so they raise her dress, and she has an underdress, right? And all this. Plenty of gender resonant language, right? around these practices, around the relation, right? Used to frame out the relationship between individuals who are involved in the rituals, the coverings, and the objects themselves. these are sort of ready, gendered paradigms that are deployed, and they work. I mean, they resonate nicely. Just happens to not be a woman, but it's a female, but it's a gendered practice that's mobilized in the language and the rituals around these objects. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGregor. That was really, really fascinating.